Of Natalee Holloway finally getting the answers they say they've longed for 18 years after that Alabama teen went missing in Aruba.
For 18 years, a mother stood in front of cameras and refused to stop asking the same question. Where is my daughter? For 18 years, the answer was silence, speculation, and a parade of lies from the one man who always seemed to know more than he was saying. Then, in the fall of 2023, in a federal courtroom in Alabama, the silence finally broke. But the truth that came out wasn't a relief. It was a confirmation of the worst thing anyone could have imagined, delivered in the flattest, coldest way possible by the person who caused it. This is the story of Natalee Holloway, who she was, what happened to her on a beach in Aruba in the early hours of May 30, 2005, and how the man responsible spent nearly 2 decades toying with a grieving family before finally telling the truth, not out of guilt, but as a bargaining chip in a plea deal for an entirely different crime. In the spring of 2005, Natalee Holloway was 18 years old, a recent graduate of Mountain Brook High School in a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. She was bright, well-liked, and headed to the University of Alabama on a pre-med track that fall. Like more than 100 of her classmates, she signed up for a graduation trip to Aruba, a small Dutch Caribbean island known for its white beaches and all-inclusive resorts. It was supposed to be 5 days of sun, freedom, and the kind of carefree send-off that marks the end of adolescence. On the night of May 29th into the early morning of May 30th, Natalee went out with friends to a bar in Oranjestad called Carlos and Charlie's. It was the group's last night on the island before their flight home. At some point that night, she left the bar with a young Dutchman she had met during the trip, 20-year-old Joran van der Sloot, along with 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpoe. The 4 of them drove off together. Natalee was never seen alive again. When her classmates boarded their flight the next morning without her, alarm turned quickly into a full-blown search. Her mother, Beth Holloway, flew to Aruba within hours and would not leave the island for weeks. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in the island's history. Divers combing the coastline, cadaver dogs working the dunes, FBI agents flown in to assist local police, and eventually military aircraft scanning the terrain with infrared cameras. None of it turned up a body, a weapon, or a single piece of hard physical evidence. Joran van der Sloot became the center of the investigation almost immediately, because he was the last person known to have been with Natalee. From the very first police interview, his account shifted. He initially told investigators that he and the Kalpoe brothers had dropped Natalee off safely at her hotel. When that story fell apart under scrutiny, he changed it, claiming instead that he had left her alone on the beach, alive and well, sometime after midnight. Aruban authorities arrested van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers in early June 2005, along with 2 hotel security guards who were later released without charge. All 3 of the original suspects gave inconsistent, sometimes contradictory statements. Van der Sloot's account moved again, this time suggesting the Kalpoe brothers had driven off with Natalee while he was dropped at home, a version investigators found dubious and believed was designed to shift blame onto the brothers after they had begun pointing fingers back at him. Deputy Police Chief Gerald Dompig, who led much of the early investigation, later said the 3 suspects had been the focus from nearly the beginning, based on surveillance and communications intercepted within days of Natalee's disappearance. Despite the suspicion, Aruban prosecutors never had enough physical evidence to bring charges. The investigation ballooned into one of the most expensive and exhaustive in the island's history, reportedly costing millions of dollars before it was over. Investigators pursued lead after lead. A gardener who claimed he'd seen van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers near a local racket club led to a pond being partially drained, which turned up nothing. A jogger's tip about men burying a blonde woman sent searchers back to a landfill that had already been combed once, and then twice more, with cadaver dogs finding no trace either time. The FBI tested duct tape recovered with blonde hair on it, hoping it might connect to Natalee. It didn't match. Even Dutch F-16 fighter jets were brought in at one point to scan the island's terrain with infrared sensors, in case a body had been buried somewhere the ground search had missed. Nothing worked because, as the world would only learn 18 years later, the search had been looking in all the wrong places from the start. Along the way, investigators also arrested and released several people who were never charged, including 2 hotel security guards briefly held on suspicion of kidnapping, and a local disc jockey implicated by one of the original suspects before being let go. At one point, van der Sloot's own father, Paulus, a former judicial official on the island, was detained and questioned before also being released without charges. A judge ultimately ordered all of the original suspects freed in September 2005, and no one has ever been convicted in Aruba for what happened to Natalee Holloway. Over the following years, the case became something of a national obsession in the United States. Endless cable news segments, tabloid theories, amateur investigations, and a non-stop cycle of speculation that made Joran van der Sloot one of the most recognizable faces in American true crime, despite never having been convicted of anything related to Natalee's disappearance. Van der Sloot did little to discourage the spotlight. In a 2006 interview with a major American news network, he offered yet another version of events, claiming Natalee wanted to have sex with him but that he declined because he didn't have a condom, and that she chose to stay behind on the beach alone while a friend picked him up. That friend's own attorney later disputed the account entirely, saying the friend had been asleep at home that night. Van der Sloot would later admit that some of what he told police in the earliest days was untrue, insisting at the time that he lied because he believed Natalee would simply turn up unharmed. It was a small, almost throwaway admission buried inside years of far bigger ones, a preview of the pattern that would define the rest of his public life. What set this case apart from an ordinary unsolved disappearance was what Van der Sloot did with his notoriety in the years that followed. Rather than fading from view, he repeatedly inserted himself back into the story, offering tantalizing hints and half-confessions, only to retract them each time. In 2008, a Dutch investigative journalist secretly filmed Van der Sloot appearing to describe being present when Natalee died and helping to dispose of her body. When the recording became public, Van der Sloot dismissed it as an elaborate lie, claiming he had invented the story to impress a stranger he believed was a drug dealer. It was a pattern that would repeat itself for years, a partial admission, followed by a denial, followed by another version entirely. Each time, the Holloway family relived the possibility of finally getting answers, only to have it snatched away again. The cruelty reached a new level in 2010. That year, Van der Sloot contacted Beth Holloway and offered to reveal the exact location of Natalee's remains, for $250,000. Holloway, desperate for any chance at closure, agreed and wired him a down payment. The location he gave her turned out to be false. It was, prosecutors would later determine, a calculated con, and it triggered federal extortion and wire fraud charges in the United States that would not catch up with him for over a decade. That same year, Van der Sloot committed an entirely separate murder. In Lima, Peru, he killed a 21-year-old woman named Stephanie Flores after she reportedly discovered information on his computer linking him to the Holloway case. He was convicted in Peru and sentenced to 28 years in prison, where he remained until 2023. It was that Peruvian sentence, and the earlier extortion indictment sitting in the American legal system, that finally brought Van der Sloot back to Alabama. In June 2023, Peru extradited him to the United States to face the extortion and wire fraud charges tied to his 2010 scheme against Beth Holloway. As part of the negotiations for a plea deal, Van der Sloot agreed to something he had refused to do for 18 years: sit down and tell investigators, on the record, exactly what happened to Natalee Holloway. In early October 2023, he did. According to the transcript of that proffer session, later filed in court, Van der Sloot described lying on the beach with Natalee that night, kissing her, and then escalating the contact without her consent. When she pushed back and told him to stop, he said she need him. He responded by kicking her in the face and then, according to his own account, picking up a cinder block lying nearby and striking her with it. He told investigators she was left unconscious, possibly already dead. He then said he walked her body into the water until it reached his knees and pushed her out into the ocean before returning home. Her remains have never been recovered. On October 18, 2023, Van der Sloot appeared in federal court in Birmingham and pleaded guilty to the extortion and wire fraud charges. As part of the arrangement, his statement about Natalee's death could not be used to charge him with her murder. The deal was structured specifically so that his confession would buy him a reduced 20-year sentence on the extortion counts rather than exposing him to a murder trial. Beth Holloway had signed off on the agreement in advance. Her attorney had negotiated it on the condition that Van der Sloot reveal, in detail, how her daughter died and what happened to her body. Van der Sloot also agreed to submit to a polygraph examination, which he passed, lending additional weight to the account he gave. Inside the courtroom, Beth Holloway addressed him directly. She told him that for 18 years he had denied killing her daughter, and that he had finally admitted the truth. She called him a killer and told him to remember it every time the jail door closed behind him. Outside the courthouse afterward, she told reporters simply that after 18 years, Natalee's case had been solved, and that Joran van der Sloot was the one who did it. The presiding judge, Anna Monosco, did not mince words either. She told Van der Sloot in open court that he had brutally murdered 2 young women, in separate incidents years apart, both of whom had refused his sexual advances, one of them being Natalee Holloway, the other Stephanie Flores. She sentenced him to 20 years, to run concurrently with his existing Peruvian sentence, and ordered him to pay restitution to Beth Holloway for the extortion scheme. If Vandersloot's account is accurate, and both the FBI and the Holloway family believe it is, the ocean took whatever physical evidence remained of Natalee Holloway almost 20 years ago. The Caribbean does not preserve, it disperses. Currents, tides, and decades of marine activity make the odds of recovering any remains from open water extraordinarily small, even with an approximate location. Investigators have said there is no active search underway for her body, largely because there is nowhere specific left to search. The case, in the sense of identifying who killed her, is closed. In the sense of bringing her home, it may never be. That reality sits at the center of what makes this resolution so difficult to call a victory. For nearly 2 decades, dozens of searches were carried out based on tips that ranged from plausible to absurd: drained ponds, landfill excavations, satellite comparisons of the island's terrain, hair and duct tape samples that were tested and ultimately excluded. Each one raised hope. Each one ended in nothing. The confession explains why. The leads were never going to work, because the truth had nothing to do with any of them. Natalee was never buried on land at all. What makes Vandersloot's case unusual isn't just the crime itself, but the sheer length and calculation of the deception that followed it. Most killers who eventually confess do so relatively close to the crime, under the weight of evidence or conscience. Vandersloot did neither for most of 2 decades. He gave interviews. He sold false information. He let a mother spend $250,000 chasing a lie he invented. He committed a second murder in the middle of it all. And when he finally told the truth, it wasn't remorse that moved him. It was a plea deal that reduced his prison time and closed the door on ever being charged with Natalee's murder directly. Beth Holloway has spoken about this tension herself, relief that the not knowing is finally over, mixed with the recognition that justice, in any conventional sense, was never really delivered. There was no murder trial. There was no jury. There was a guilty plea to fraud charges, and a confession that legally cannot be used against him for the crime it describes. The 20-year sentence he received runs alongside the time he was already serving in Peru, meaning the Holloway case, in practical terms, added little to how long he will actually spend behind bars. The years of uncertainty didn't just put Vandersloot under public scrutiny, they put the Holloway family there as well. Beth Holloway became a fixture on national television, appearing repeatedly on major talk and news programs to keep pressure on Aruban authorities and to keep her daughter's name in the headlines. Her advocacy undoubtedly helped keep the investigation active long after most missing persons cases would have faded from view, but it also drew criticism. Some in Aruba felt the family's public statements, including allegations that Vandersloot and the Calpo brothers had sexually assaulted Natalee, and suggestions that Aruban police were incompetent or corrupt, went further than the evidence at the time could support.